And as you all can tell, Bev is awesome and we can't do anything without her. She's helped organize the Zoom for all of us. So just thank you, Bev.
Oh, thank you.
Welcome, yes, and welcome everyone. Pardon me for reading this, but first it's with a great deal of pleasure that I share Swan's mission and purpose. And the Southwest Agroforestry Action Network's mission is helping people integrate trees, crops, and animals to regenerate Southwest landscapes. Swan's scope of interest is forest and agricultural activities on tribal, state, federal, county, municipal, and private lands in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. Our purpose is to share information and connect potential collaborators and partners, generate ideas, research, and initiatives, and increase adoption of agroforestry in the Southwest United States by agricultural producers, forest landowners, and communities. So with no further ado, and on behalf of the Southwest Agroforestry Action Network and in partnership with the Arizona Community Tree Council, I'd like to introduce Dr. James Allen. Dr. James Allen is a professor with the School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University, Flagstaff, Arizona. He served as its executive director from 2007 to 2021. He is a founding member and immediate past chair of the Southwest Agroforestry Action Network. Dr. Allen's interest in agroforestry and food forests dates to his work as a Peace Corps volunteer in Swaziland. His involvement in agroforestry in the Southwest began in 2017 when he took a sabbatical and spent part of it investigating current practices in this region. So with no further ado, Jim, I'll turn it over to you and just thank you for presenting this morning.
All right, well, thank you very much, Donna, for that introduction. And as always, thank you, Bev, for all the logistical support you provide for these webinars and for Swan in general. We really very much appreciate that. So I'm really pleased to be able to present on this project that I've been involved in personally down at Arcosanti. That's a food forest project, and what you're looking at here is the landscape where Arcosanti is located. I'll tell you a little bit more about it here in a second, but this is the setting where we are working on this food forest project. It's in, I would say, central Arizona, about halfway between Flagstaff and Phoenix. So what I'd like to do is to kind of give you a little sense of what Arcosanti is, because I'm assuming a lot of you are not familiar with it. Then we'll get into the Arcosanti Food Forest project itself and talk a little bit about the goals, the site, the design work, where we are in terms of implementation, and a little bit about what we intend to do next. Before I do that, though, I wanted to give credit where credit is due, and there are a number of people involved in this project. Up in the upper left is Kelly Bull, who I think is on this call. Kelly is a permaculture designer. At the time that this project got started, she was also working at Orm School, which is really close to Arcosanti. And so she played a really significant role in the design, the conceptual design, and the actual schematic sort of design for this project, and helped with the early implementation. Scott Riley, who you see pictured there on the lower left, he is a long-term resident of Arcosanti, and he was kind of the irrigation guru. He helped design and set up the irrigation system that we use for this food forest, and continues to help in that regard. Two really central players are pictured there on the right. Casey Jones is a nearby resident. He's not a resident of Arcosanti, but he brings a lot of expertise in horticulture, in fruit tree propagation. He has his own food forest, and he has been really a central player in this whole project. And then on the right is David Tallis, who is a long-term resident of Arcosanti and is really the day-to-day person who makes this happen, who's doing much of the implementation, much of the maintenance. Without him, we wouldn't have this food forest project. Pictured in between is Moussa Souley, who was at that time a visiting scholar at NEU. And quite frequently, he would come down with me to Arcosanti to work on the project. And in this picture here, we were over at Casey's house. And Souley, I know you're on this call as well, so welcome. Good to see you. I know you're back in Niger, so I'm glad you were able to join us in real time. So these were really central players. There were a lot of other people involved, but these were, I would say, really key members of the team. In case you're wondering why Professor at NEU is talking about this project down at Arcosanti, as Donna mentioned, I've gotten interested in agroforestry fairly recently after a long period of doing other things between the Peace Corps and 2017. And with Andy Mason, who is a co-founder of Swan, we did a survey on food forests in this region, mostly in urban areas. We published that last year. So I have this academic interest in food forests and agroforestry more generally, but there's a big difference between having this academic interest and visiting food forests for short visits and actually helping to establish one. And that's why I feel really privileged to be part of this Arcosanti project. I go down there fairly frequently to help with the work down there at Arcosanti. And it's been really enlightening to do that as opposed to just visiting and doing surveys of food forests. All right, so what is Arcosanti? For those who have never been there, and probably a fair number of you have not, what is this place that we're doing this work at? Well, it's an experimental town located, as it says there, in the high desert, roughly between Flagstaff and Phoenix. And it's been there a while. It's actually a 52-year-old experimental town. And it's about ways to live in urban environments, even though it's in a rural area. It's kind of an urban laboratory. And it's based on this concept called Arcology, which is the combination of kind of unique architecture and ecology to create this sustainable living environment. It really does emphasize both a frugal kind of lifestyle and environmental sustainability, which I think makes it a really good fit for things like food forests. One thing that I found very appealing in terms of a place to do a food forest project is that it attracts visitors from all over the region and really the world. And they get 20, 25,000 visitors a year or something like that every year. And they come from all over the place. And it just seems like an excellent place to do kind of a demonstration of sustainability practices, agroforestry practices, including food forests. Just an amazing place to do that kind of demonstration work, both for the Southwest and really for drylands more extensively. And so much of the world consists of dryland kind of habitats. This is what the building area looks like up on the mesa. So there's a mesa, and then down below there's some really nice land for agricultural purposes. This is up on the mesa, showing what the actual community looks like, the architectural elements of it, which are in many ways really unique and fascinating. If you haven't visited, I really encourage you to try to do that when you get a chance. As I mentioned, there's a lot of visitors, and the reason you get a lot of visitors is because there's so much attention that's paid to this unique experiment. And so even pretty recently, there's coverage. This is a 52-year-old community. We still get coverage pretty frequently. You can see that article on the right. Arcosanti is Arizona's environmentally friendly urban habitat, published in 2020. The Guardian and BBC both featured Arcosanti not that terribly long ago. And so it gets truly international as well as local and regional attention. And so it seems like there's few better places really to demonstrate things like these agroforestry practices in a place where people come and readily could see it. So one thing that's happening at Arcosanti, it kind of ebbs and flows in terms of the level of activity there. But in recent years, and I would say just in the last few years, really, there's been this effort to revitalize the agricultural program there. And these are some photos of some of the other agricultural activities, like a microgreens operation. And they have a little terraced set of beds there, like in the lower right, where they're growing annual crops mostly. They have a high tunnel where they also grow mostly annual crops. So they have this diversified, mostly small scale effort at revitalizing agriculture and tying it directly to that community. So these pictures here are from several years ago, but in just this last year, there have been two new efforts to revitalize agriculture at Arcosanti. On the left, you see an early depiction of a cornfield growing down below the buildings, down in the agricultural area. And that is a Hopi variety of corn. This last spring, a speaker came from the Hopi reservation, talked about what he does up there. He looked at this land and said, hey, why don't we plant some of our corn down here? And that's exactly what has been done. And that corn, much of it has since been harvested. And then on the right, there was a orchard established this past spring, a small, more traditional type orchard. And that picture there is from earlier this month, how it looked on the 1st of October. Kind of right between these two sites, I don't know if you can see my arrow here or not, cursor, roughly between the corn and the orchard is where the food forest is located. And I'll point out, if you can see my cursor, this building here and these tanks here are part of the irrigation system that I'll touch on here in a second. So why the food forest at Arcosanti? I've hinted at it a little bit, some of the reasons, but I want to get into that in just a little bit more depth real quickly here. So I mentioned this revitalization effort regarding agriculture, Arcosanti, and that is, this is a central part of it. That's how it really originated, was in discussions that were about revitalizing agriculture more generally. It could be another source, it hopefully will be, and to some degree already has been, a additional source of food for their cafe. They have a cafe for both residents and visitors, and they have a kind of an informal internal farmers market, and some products from the food forest have already found their way to both of these. The reason I'm involved is primarily this, the potential of this site for education and demonstration. It's just a phenomenal site for that kind of work. I mean, it's close enough to universities like NAU and ASU and smaller colleges like Yavapai College. It can serve for extension purposes. You get all the more casual day visitors or overnight visitors. So many people have the opportunity to get to this site and while they're there to learn about food forests. Arcosanti has this desire to be a leader in sustainability practices that can be applied in both urban and rural settings. And certainly this would be another example of such a practice that they can help demonstrate. And then finally, this is a rural area located not too far from an interstate exit. But to get to the nearest grocery store, you have to drive a pretty good ways. The nearest food is like McDonald's and things of that sort. So you could call this a food desert. I think it legitimately meets the definition of a rural food desert. And I think there's this opportunity to connect to the larger community to produce food, not just for Arcosanti residents, but for that larger community in the immediate area. So there's all these different kinds of potential that make this a really excellent site for this kind of work. This is a new project, relatively new. I'm going to go through the timeline and just give you a sense of that. So the idea itself started back in January 2020 with a meeting on the site to talk about agroforestry and kind of related to the educational component as well. The meeting was convened by the educational director at that time. but there were people from Swan, there were people from U of A Extension, local residents, and Arcosanti residents at that meeting. We decided to go ahead with the food forest, and over the course of the spring, early summer, did some design work and planning for it. We actually got started on what I would call the bones of the project, some of the basins and paths that summer and into the fall of 2020. Some of the first planting happened in the fall of 2020. I think it was November of 2020. And most of that was just transplanted trees from Casey Jones's property. And it was pretty small scale. That spring, basically the growing season of 2021, we started to do some additional planting and tending, and continued that to some degree as well through this last growing season. And this last growing season was also when the orchard and the Hopi corn planting in the immediate vicinity was done. This is just an example of one of those early planning meetings. Both Andy Mason and I were there representing Swan. Kelly, there on the far right, was there helping with the design work. And over on the far left is Isaac Mpanga, who is a U of A Extension officer. And then you have Arcosanti residents as well there at this meeting, which was held in the vault, which you can see in the upper left, one of the interesting, unique architectural features at Arcosanti. All right, so where are we doing this work? So in this image, you can see the buildings there on the left, the main part of Arcosanti. You can actually see an olive orchard just above where the buildings are. But then to the right, it may not be that apparent, but a good 100 or so feet below where the buildings are is this broad, flat area that is really suitable for agricultural purposes. It has pretty good soil. And then you can see along the sort of upper right of this image is the Agua Fria River. The upper part of the river is actually perennial there, and then lower part is ephemeral. And you can see that big mesquite gallery over on the other side. But the area that's outlined in the rectangle, that is where we're working. That is where the food forest project is located. Right just above that, there's a kind of whitish pale area, almost like a triangle. That's where the orchard is. And if you can picture the bottom of that rectangle, that point at the bottom, that's roughly where the Hopi corn was planted. Zooming in a little more, there's really two parts that we want to work on for this food forest. The rectangle in kind of orange is the main part that we're focusing on. There's a fairly big open area. There's an area in the upper part that's shaded by paulownia trees. The lower part is outlined by kind of a windbreak of Arizona cypress. So that is where most of the work has been focused, is inside that rectangle. The area outlined in blue is a natural mesquite stand. And the idea is for that to feature a food forest with native plants. So strictly native plants that either are food or medicinal plants. And so we have done a little bit of work in there, but it hasn't been the focus to date. The main focus has been inside that rectangle. Then you can see those two areas that are circled. The lower circle is a pump house, and that is powered by solar power. And that pumps water from a really shallow aquifer that they're blessed to have up to 2 tanks. Only one is shown in this older image, but now there are 2 tanks inside that upper circle, which is a bit higher in elevation. It's probably about 30 feet higher than the pump house. And then that feeds by gravity down to a irrigation system that feeds both that food forest and the adjacent orchard, which is that pale area right above it. That's where the orchard has been planted. So they are blessed to have a reliable water supply and to be able to supply that water using solar power. It's really nice. So I mentioned the design work and Kelly's role in that. And this is the design concept that she came up with. And this focuses mainly on that area in the rectangle. And you can see some areas, again, I'm not sure if you're seeing my cursor, but if you are, these are the paulownia trees here, these kind of paler green or almost grayish green trees. And then the other circles that have labels inside them, those were the trees, the plan for planting new trees or shrubs. And you can see an outline of paths, a network of paths. And if you can see those blue dotted lines, those are outlines for shallow basins. Most of the trees or shrubs were to be planted in a series of shallow basins. So this was a really nice design project. Thank you, Kelly, for doing this. She consulted periodically with the rest of the team, but this is really her work. And maybe I'll put in a quick plug for her continuing work with this group called United Designers, a group of permaculture designers that she is a member of and does this work professionally. So this was the overall plan for this food forest. So then we got to work. We had a plan, we got to work. And referring back to what I said earlier about kind of frugal living, we did almost all this work by hand, almost all of it, well, really all of it with volunteer labor. We had some work parties of residents from Arcosanti. We had occasional visitors help. But here you see scenes of laying out the paths in the lower right. The way we did that was we would mow the vegetation, lay cardboard on top of it, lay mulch on top of that, and make our paths that way. The basins were literally dug with picks and shovels. You can see a scene of digging one of the shallow basins there in the upper left. And we went at this kind of slowly, like every other week we'd work for 2 or 3 hours. And so it wasn't like we did this overnight. There was a lot of physical labor done periodically with volunteer groups in a very sort of frugal fashion. By that fall, things were beginning to take shape in terms of the basins and the paths. And so you can see a work party here actually digging one of the basins. You can see over on the left, there's a ladder here. They were working on the fence too, making the fence higher than it was originally in this site. So this is just an example of the work ongoing, this periodic sort of work party approach that we took with hand tools, making these paths, making these basins, following as best we could that plan that Kelly provided for us. And over time, it really began to take shape. So by the spring of 2021, here's an aerial image showing the outline of those paths and showing that the basins have in fact been constructed. Almost all of them are constructed in the scene. There are a few of the trees planted. Those kind of pale circles are for the most part were trees or shrubs that had already been planted. And so it was beginning to take shape, the beginning of the spring of 2021. And that was the first full growing season was 2021. These scenes show pictures of the irrigation work. Again, much of that done by hand. You can see like in the upper right, digging a trench to lay some of the irrigation pipe down below. In the lower right, you see a student from Yavapai College beginning to put in place some of the above ground drip irrigation. The kind of central distribution system there is in the lower left. That is where the water comes down from the tanks and gets distributed across the different irrigation lines. There's now 3 different lines that feed the food forest. That picture in the upper left looks like there's a run on the outhouse, but that's not an outhouse. That's the solar pump house. And that's what pumps water up the hill to the tank. And so that's a group of students who are learning about the irrigation system. So that just kind of an educational part of this whole effort. It was in November of 2020 that we began to transplant some trees, and most of them were considerably smaller than this one. this initial group all came from Casey Jones's place, which is, I think, 5 or 6 miles away from Arcosanti. So in the same, roughly the same environment. And these were seedlings or saplings that were doing well over Casey's that he didn't need. So they were dug up by these students. Kelly, I know, was involved as well. They were transplanted over. The two students, the two people on the right are Yavapai College students who were in a class that Kelly was teaching at that time. The person on the left he was an Arcosanti resident at that time. So that was kind of exciting to see trees beginning to get in the ground after that first summer of really just making paths and basins periodically. By that summer, kind of midsummer, you see a picture of just one of the trees that was planted, a few guild plants around it, and things were just getting rolling that first growing season. One thing we learned during that growing season, I don't think for most people these would be necessarily shocking things, but we definitely learned as we went through this project. There were some challenges that we faced that first year. One had to do with just keeping control of the weeds. An open field like this, naturally weeds are going to come in, and they came in pretty strong, and they came in different waves with grasses and pigweed, and just it seemed like there were like 3 different waves of weeds that came in. So it got pretty weedy, and we would have parties to kind of attack those weeds over time. A challenge I'm not depicting on this slide is just the labor involved in doing this work and having people consistently on site to keep up with it. That is an ongoing challenge that we face. That same growing season, we had a really major outbreak of lubbers, a type of grasshopper. They were everywhere in the weeds. And at first we didn't worry about them because they were down in the weeds. But as the season progressed, they started to move up into the trees. A tree like this peach here was like totally defoliated by the end of the season. And so we did face some real challenges, which we fortunately did not face this current year. But last year we were really slammed by lubbers, pretty big grasshoppers. And then one thing we learned, I think we sort of knew, but we learned firsthand, was that this site sits in kind of a cold air drainage location. So I've turned that earlier image on 90 degrees so that I could fit it in here. But you see at the top of the image there is where the buildings are, and that's at least 100 feet higher than the food forest site, which is down towards the bottom of this image. And cold air drains right down that hill, and it drains right up against those cypress trees and kind of hold those cypress trees, I'm sure, hold some of that cold air in place. So earlier this spring, after things had leafed out, we were down there and we noticed that the trees in the food forest, the leaves had been basically killed by the freezing temperatures. Just up the hill a little bit, not even really up the hill, just out of the shade of the cypress where the orchard is. Again, this area here, if you can see my cursor, those trees were not impacted at all. It was the trees in here that were impacted by that frost damage. And so that may be an ongoing issue when we have late frosts in the future, unless we maybe thin out or prune heavily those cypress trees. But this year, things are looking, I feel like they're looking pretty good. You know, this is only the second growing season, and the trees are coming on pretty strongly. Some of the same trees that lost their leaves early in the spring leafed out and grew quite a bit over the summer. And so you can see these trees on the left looking really strong and healthy. A tree like this one here, really a shrub. This is a Siberian pea shrub that's now about 6 feet tall. It was only 2 feet tall when we planted it. So things are looking good. The weeds are under a lot better control. The lubbers didn't come back. So this second year, I feel like things are really beginning to get established. While the trees are growing and in various gaps, the people like David Tallis have planted melons and squash and garlic. And those are the kinds of products that are finding their way up to the farmer's market and the cafe. So they're getting products out of this site already while we're waiting for the trees to reach a degree of maturity where they're producing. The only fruit that we got in to any degree were jujubes in this second year. I recently heard a talk where the person said, this is the pattern you can expect with fruit trees. The first year they sleep, and that's kind of what happened. The second year they creep, and they crept pretty nicely this second year. The third year they leap, and that hopefully we'll see some really robust growth in these trees in the next growing season, especially if we don't have a late frost to kind of set them back a bit. So that is kind of what we're hoping will happen over time. Again, we've only been through 2 growing seasons, and some of these trees were not even planted in the first growing season. So what do we hope will happen? 2 weeks ago, I was at a food forest at Verde Valley School, which is up near Sedona. And this is a little bit of an older food forest, not very old, though it's only 6 years old. And it's a really nicely developing food forest. They've already had some really good harvests of fruit from these trees. And they have this really, really diverse understory as well. And so this is kind of what we're hoping will happen over time, is that we'll start to see our food forest develop to look similar to one like this. Since this is at a school, it's really nice to see them have other elements besides just the plants. So, they have educational signs like this one on the quince tree. They have artwork like you can see in the middle here. It's kind of a cool project, this food forest at Verde Valley School, which is a small private school not too far from Sedona. And then I think what we'd like to see is it develop along the lines of what Casey's place looks like. And it's really hard to do justice to Casey's with a couple photos, but here are 2 photos. One on the left shows the older part of his food forest, and you can see very well established fruit trees, and he has this amazing variety of them, including both native and non-native plants, and really healthy, productive food forest. And then he has a new phase of it located nearby, and that's pictured on the lower right, and that is coming on really strong as well. So it's been great to have his expertise, his knowledge of what performs well in this same type of environment. He's been a huge asset, and a lot of us have gone over to learn from Casey directly about propagation and management of food forest type species. It's possible that over time, our food forests will begin to look like the most mature one that I'm aware of in the Southwest, the one at the Central Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute up in Basalt, Colorado, Jerome Osentowski's place. That is truly an amazing and incredibly productive, multi-layered food forest. But that takes years. I mean, this one was established in the late 80s, began to be established then. So some of the next steps we have in mind, we would like to do more work over in the mesquite area, which is pictured there on the left. We have this widely spaced stand of mesquite. We've done some pruning to let more light down into the ground. We have done some planting both in the mesquite and immediately adjacent to the mesquite. And it hasn't been the primary focus to date, but we hope over time to develop that area as well, so that we can have both a native themed food forest and one that has more non-native traditional fruit trees as the main focus. We also wanted to develop the understory and develop some guilds. And you see one of the beginnings of that over in the main food forest, which is this hummingbird bush that really, we planted it this past spring, and it's really leapt up. It's grown really well. When I was there on October 1st, there were literally hummingbirds buzzing it as well as butterflies. And, we want to build the understory over time, partly as just plain old understory and partly as design guilds. But for now, the focus has been more on the overstory trees. a lot of work to do in the future, a lot of work that's been done to date, and that we hope to sustain this effort. While we're doing this, we're already realizing some of the potential that is exciting to me as an educator. We've had a lot of people come and help us at this food forest. And during the first season, we had groups from AmeriCorps and from Pacific Discovery come and help us dig those basins and make those paths. And they came fairly often. It was really nice to have these fairly large groups of young people come, provide both physical labor. They helped us make some of these signs you see them holding. They were just a real joy to have, but it was really, in my opinion, about education, letting these people know what a food forest is, why you might want to make one, things of that sort. It was really, I think, beginning to see that potential almost from the very, very beginning, that sort of educational and demonstration type potential. When these groups came, we usually had the opportunity to give them a talk about food forests. So we certainly put them to work, but we also would give a talk, show them some pictures and things like that, so that they kind of get a sense of what they were doing and why they were doing it and what it might look like in the future. So that was really a pleasure for me to be part of some of these talks to these visiting groups. We hope to have many, many more of these kind of groups over the years. It's also beginning to become part of Arcosanti's own educational system. They offer workshops, they offer a lecture series, they have visiting groups that come and stay for varying periods and can spend time in the food forest. And so these are screenshots from their websites that are parts of the website where they highlight to some degree the fact that they have this food forest now. It's part of their agricultural program, part of what they can teach visitors. We're beginning to see workshops, some of which can actually use the food forest. That picture in the upper right is of Casey Jones teaching a workshop earlier this year on canning and garden to table food preservation. But he's also going to be teaching workshops on drip irrigation, plant propagation, and things of that sort, some of which will use the food forest site. So it's becoming an asset to Arcosanti as part of their broader educational mission as well. And it's only going to get better over time if it continues to develop the way it seems to be developing so far. One thing that food forests seem to attract, most of the more mature food forests that I've been to seem to attract this kind of thing, is that they attract other kinds of facilities. In this case, there were two little structures that have been built either in the orchard or the food forest that were built by architectural students who spend some of their time at Arcosanti, and part of their work involves building a small structure. And these structures can be used for visiting groups to kind of gather in. They could be used for glamping. They could be used for various purposes, but they're just another way to have people come and enjoy and spend time at these sites, the orchard and the food forest. They're only 50, 60 yards apart. These two structures are really close. And some of the older food forests I've seen have artwork. They become aesthetically pleasing. They become places where people just want to spend time relaxing. And I think that's going to happen here over time as well. We need to get the trees in place. We need to get them to grow. But along the way, we're also thinking about these kinds of facilities, some of which are actually being established as we speak. I don't know if you can see this pole sticking up here in the upper right. The lower right picture, but on the right side of it, there's this kind of wooden pole that was put up by some students, some visiting workshop folks as well. And the idea is they're going to string lights from that and have a little gathering place in the orchard over time. So there's neat things like that that can go along with these food forest projects. So a number of years ago, there was a person working at Arcosanti named Adam Norfor, and he was very involved in the agricultural program. And he developed a vision for this site that is really quite an intriguing one. So you can see the building site there in the upper part of this image. And you can see that sort of lake there. And there is a dike that holds water periodically right in that location. The area circled is where the food forest and the orchard are located now. And then those fields down below the circle, the one in the upper left is where the Hopi corn is located, but they have a rather large field that can be used for different purposes. We've talked about whether it could be used for alley cropping or silvopasture, for example. They got fields even further down that have mesquite in them and that could easily be adapted for a silvopasture approach. They have that land where the mesquite gallery is on the right. They could build the terraces. Those terraces you see below the buildings are not there, but conceivably could be there and could be almost like another food forest location. There's so much potential at this site. They're blessed with good land. They're blessed with water. They're blessed with a site where many visitors can come. They could have interns there. They could have woofers there. You know, they could have all this kind of stuff. And in terms of a place for agroforestry in the Southwest, it's really hard to imagine one that could be better, that has more potential than Arcosanti. And so to close out here, before I open it up, see if there's any questions, I would just say, if you're interested in this, please do visit. I can help you facilitate a visit. If you're a student or somebody who might actually have the potential to do some work there, be it research or physical work, whatever, let me know. We can help facilitate that. If you just have ideas, you know, please share them. We would really like to see this become, you know, just a center for agroforestry, sustainable agriculture, more generally, agroecology. It just fits with the broader mission that Arcosanti itself has. And for demonstrating work in the Southwest, again, it just really, I would consider it to be ideal. So that is the last slide that I have. I do hope there's time for questions or discussion. And like I said, I really encourage you, if you're interested and have the ability to maybe get a little bit involved in this. I'll leave this up, Bev, in case anybody wants to refer to a particular image, or I could stop sharing, whichever you all prefer.
No, I think you're right. Keep that up so that if you need to go back to an image, you can. We had one question about rainwater harvesting, and that was sort of answered with the basins, but maybe a little bit more on what the rainwater harvesting process and strategy is.
Yeah, there's a little bit of rainwater harvesting that goes on up in the building site itself, and that can help with some of the landscaping in the village. I would call it like a little urban village. And so there is some rainwater harvesting that goes on up there. You know, they certainly harvest the flow that comes down that drain into that area that's depicted as a small lake. And when I was there in October, early October, there was water in it, you know, quite a bit of water actually. So they do have the ability to use some of that water. But the orchard and the food forest are not using rainwater harvesting. They're using that shallow aquifer, which is fed to some degree by that big pond. I'm sure some of that infiltrates right into the aquifer. And also you got that river right there on the right, the Agua Fria River, part of which you can't really see in the scene, but part of it is perennial. And so they're really blessed with that very shallow aquifer in solar power to draw upon it. But yeah, that whole area, and maybe where those terraces are, if they build some of those terraces, there's a huge opportunity to harvest rainwater from the buildings, from what pavement they have up there, and to use that for irrigation up there in the higher elevations.
Okay, thank you. There was a question from Mary, if you have integrated animals into any areas, or are there plans to? I think well, I know I was thinking about all them grasshoppers and chickens.
Yes, we should have. There is actually a chicken coop. And Bev, have you been able to see my cursor or not?
Yes, yeah, your
Okay,
cursor is.
So the cursor is
yeah.
sitting right on a poultry barn, which is right there on the edge of the food forest. And that first year, we did not let the chickens roam through the food forest, but now they occasionally do, and there's peacocks as well. And they have always had access because they can get over the fence. And so, but yeah, we probably could have used the poultry a little more efficiently. In the past, they've had goats, and in that whole field area, this last summer, maybe it was the end of last summer, first summer, they fenced this off with electric fencing and had cattle in it for a while. But we've been talking about, could we line this with trees and make it like a silvopasture operation? Or could we do silvopasture down here, integrate animals that way? But for now, the only animals on site are chickens and peacocks.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Thank you. And Sarah asked, do you do any soil building on site?
Yes. So we did soil analyses in the beginning, sent off soil samples. Soil is actually really good. It's a Gila series, and if you read up on the Gila series soil, it's one of the best agricultural soils in the state. It's really good soil. But Arcosanti has something like 800 acres that they own outright, and then several thousand acres that they have a lease on with the state trust, state trust land that they lease from the state lands department. And they have a rancher who operates on that. And that rancher has been really good at bringing over cattle manure and also helping bring over mulch. And those basins have been filled to some degree with kind of aged manure and mulch material that has been brought over. So those are our soil building approaches primarily. We're not using chemical fertilizers, we're not using pesticides, it's all organic. We do have some nitrogen fixing plants, and we have comfrey. We have some comfrey to help with soil building. But in terms of bulk effort, it's been primarily that cattle manure the rancher brings over and some mulch organic material that's been brought over as well. And you can already see the response in that soil. It's really kind of nice to see. There's more living animals, there's worms and invertebrates. It just feels richer already, and it's only been through 2 growing seasons. So in my opinion, we're seeing soil effects already that are really desirable. That would be a great study for somebody, a student or soil scientist, to actually document some of these changes in soil that are happening.
Okay, let's see. So Kelly followed up on that and says they also have a composting operation going on in the Mesquite area. So that's some additional information. And Christy, her question is, are there problems or challenges that would be helpful to the community for visiting students or faculty to pursue through research or other engagement?
I think there's a lot of potential for research, both on site. We mentioned the soil, pest control might be a good one. Organic approaches to management. This whole idea of guilds and whether they really truly have an impact. There's all these kind of research projects, some of which are really small scale and could be done by students over the course of even a semester. And we have had students from NAU come down there and do work, one of which was an undergraduate research project. I think there's some really interesting social dimensions that could be extended to the larger community. Is this a food desert, right? Things like that. And how can Arcosanti and its agriculture program contribute directly? Can we have a partnership with some of the other adjacent areas like Orem School or Chauncey Ranch, places that might be able to come together and form a partnership? So there's socioeconomic research that could be done. There's certainly work that can be done to help us do perhaps more effective work in terms of managing these trees, documenting. productivity, documenting carbon sequestration. I mean, there's a long list of potential possibilities for research, and I would welcome it. And I know David and Casey and others would also welcome this kind of involvement. They have been so far.
So I know that Arcosanti has interns. My understanding was that most of those interns were there for design purposes and some architecture.
Yeah. So
Do they have interns for the agriculture as well?
They have a range of different possibilities. You mentioned the architecture. They actually have a formal program with architecture students who are resident on site for several months every year. And those are the folks who built those two little structures I showed pictures of. So they have that formal thing. That is a formal agreement with a program based in Phoenix, where they spend part of their time down there and part of their time at Arcosanti. They have workshop participants. These are like paid participants who come and spend several weeks and learn a lot about not only agriculture, but maybe some of the other aspects of arcology. So for people who have that ability, there is that option. And some of those workshops are agriculturally themed and have spent time working with David Tallis. There are volunteer opportunities of other kinds, like our students who came down like every other Friday last spring and just helped out with David. They work with David. They also went over to Casey's place and worked with him a little bit. So there's a range of different opportunities, and it can, I can't make promises because I'm not a resident, but I'm just confident that if people want to spend some time there one way or another, it can be facilitated. They are limited on housing, but if people can visit for the day or possibly for a short term, things can be arranged, definitely.
Okay, thank you. Question: what is meant by the term guild in the context of a food forest?
Yeah. A guild is I would say it's a deliberate grouping of plants, usually centered by a particular tree, say, and then you have a small group of plants around it that are planted with multiple purposes in mind. You might have nitrogen fixing plants, you might have medicinal plants, you might have pollinating plants. The idea is that they interact in some deliberate way with each other to benefit both the tree and each other and the overall productivity of the site. So the idea is it's a little bit different than just randomly planting stuff under a tree, but you're planting with a deliberate purpose in mind. And if you're willing, Kelly, maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit, because she's the permaculture expert that I know is in the audience, if she's still here.
Yeah, I think you did a great job explaining it. It's just intentional grouping of plants that have different ecological functions that all really support each other. And when you plant them together intentionally, they grow better together than they would apart. So,
okay.
All right, thank you. Another question was, have you received any outside financial assistance, state, federal, or other?
I'm trying to think. I don't believe we've received any funding to date that's directly for the food forest. They did get an NRCS grant for work in the immediate area that might help them with the field that has the mesquite in it right now down the lower part, and also with some restoration along the river. But there has been no grant. We've put in a couple applications, but so far unsuccessfully for some work in the food forest. And we could use a little additional funding to buy more trees and understory plants, maybe to sponsor an intern, that kind of thing. But to date, it's all been volunteer labor, a little bit of contribution of funds, either from Casey or David or from Arcosanti. So we've been scrounging together the resources to date, which, to some degree fits with Arcosanti's frugal living idea. But at the same time, we would love to get a small grant. If anybody has ideas of what might be a good fit, let us know. We might put a proposal together, because that would accelerate the progress for sure if we were able to flesh out these plantings with more plant material, because it gets pretty pricey if you're buying nursery material.
Mm,
We are
agreed.
doing
Just
some
to let
of our
you
own
know,
propagation.
the person, Susan, that's Susan Stein, and she's well known in the agroforestry world, who asked that question, and she may be someone we want to contact to
Yeah,
look at some future.
please do contact me if you have ideas. I didn't put my email on this presentation. It's really a simple one, just james.allen@nau.edu, but we can provide it one way or another.
Okay, all right. Thank you, thank you. Hi, Susan. Okay,
Hi, nice to
so
see everyone.
very nice to see you.
I'll be in touch with you, Jim.
Oh, thank you.
Do we have any other questions while you're thinking about that? Just a reminder, if you are here for CEUs, I need you to put your CEU number in the chat. We'll use that to verify your attendance and provide the CEUs. So if you could do that, if you haven't already. And I'm about to turn this back over to Donna, and then we will finish this presentation portion of it up, stop the recording, and then start our Swan meeting. So Donna.
Well, and guess what? I had a question too, and maybe with Kelly on and Jim. Back at that slide with the actual design of the food forest, I would be curious to know what some of those species were. And part of it too is some of the fruit trees. I wonder if some of those were heirloom suggestions or if they were indigenous suggestions. I noticed you mentioned jujube, so it would be fun to walk through what you planted if we have time.
Yeah. So what you're looking at is the design that was put together by Kelly, and it's probably hard to read, right? I don't know that you can read. There's quite a variety here. There's there are apples and pears and peaches, and there's the jujube, there's loquats, there's a lot of different things, some of which have actually been planted, some of which have yet to be planted. We haven't exactly put everything right where this design says called for. We were kind of opportunistic in terms of what we could get and what we could plant. And so we have some varieties that are almost like Home Depot, really common varieties that we got either literally from a place like Home Depot or from Verde Valley Growers, who does provide varieties that are known to do well in this region, Verde River Growers, excuse me. We've taken material transplanted from Casey's place that is known to do well as well. And so we've planted a lot of these different species, and we're hoping to plant others. I mean, we have planted some native ones, like the sumac, for example, and buffalo berry. Jujube is not a native, but it's becoming more common around parts of the Southwest. We're propagating some elderberry that should be available to go in the ground this next growing season. So we're chipping away at this list here, but not following exactly to the letter what species go where according to Kelly's design. We just weren't able to do that because of the availability of material.
And I'll add, Jim, that when we started coming up with the plant list to go in here, it was kind of a combination of what does well in the area. I was always looking for the most drought tolerant species, and then also what we had available. So a lot of things Casey Jones had extra at his house and said we could dig them up, so we put them on the plant list. So it was really what we had available. And then as far as where they went in the design, I grouped things most accordingly to water needs. So if you look at the top left corner, that bed at the top left is the most drought tolerant one. So you have the jujubes and pomegranates and goji berries all together, so that ideally that bed could actually just live on rainwater alone. So it's really grouped by water needs.
Yeah, it was nice to have Kelly and her concepts, and We're working on it, Kelly. Kelly has since moved to Colorado, so she's not able to come and check on it very frequently or at all, really, since you moved to Colorado, I don't think.
You're doing such a great job, and I'm so impressed. And I just also want to thank you and your role for this, because it's so easy to have like momentum at the beginning and enthusiasm, and we had all these volunteers at the beginning, and
Yeah.
that you have been this on-running thread, weaving it all together throughout the rest of the project and documenting and making it so that I can see where this has gone. So it's so fun to see you guys still working on this, and it's amazing. So thank you for still being involved with it.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. It's been a real joy to be part of this, and it's just fun to work on it physically, get out of the office and go down there and wield a pick or a shovel or something. And but also as an academic who has this interest in agroforestry, you really need to get your hands dirty to get a better feel for what's involved in this kind of work. And so it's been incredibly useful for me to be going down there as often as I do.
Thank
But
you.
you do realize you're setting yourself up. I saw Diomi with the Association for Temperate Agroforestry, and they're still looking to Swan to host one of our national events one of these days.
Yeah, well, there's more and more things to show around here, but give us a few more years.
Yeah, exactly.
But I keep learning of new things like that Verde Valley School, for example. That is a really interesting project, and I did not know about that until 2 weekends ago.
All right, any other questions before we stop the recording and turn this over to the next part of the program? All right, Donna, if you want to do a wrap up on this, and then I'll stop the recording and we'll get going.
Well, first of all, let's just give a big thank you to Jim for putting this together. Wasn't it awesome, everyone? Give him a hand.
Yeah, well, thanks for the invitation. It was fun.
Yes, and I'm just really looking forward to looking up some of these papers you put together, like the Urban Food Forest in the American Southwest, written by yourself. And I noticed Andy Mason was
Yeah,
on.
Andy and I did a visit to most of those food forests. We visited together, and so that was a fun project. And Andy is so central to Swan. I know he's traveling right now, he's not here, but he is such a central player to the fact that we even have this webinar happening, and that we have this group called Swan.
Yes, and I think with that, just to comment that Andy is retired he was the national director at the National Agroforestry Center in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I noticed some others in the audience, Christopher Jones, he's also with the Swan and present. And of course, you've met Kelly, she's part of Swan. So I just want to give a kudos. And I know Andy couldn't make it today. I think he's at a reunion somewhere. And then also Mitch
O'Neill.
Thank you. He's not present today. He's also retired and traveling around somewhere this fall, but from New Mexico. So great we're little but mighty, I think.
Yeah.
Or at least working on it.
I want to do a shout out to Susan Stein too. Susan was the person who replaced Andy as director of the National Agroforestry Center, the USDA Center. It's good to see her here as well.
And Susan, I think if you want to pop up and say hi too, I didn't know. I think you're retired now, but also working somewhere new.
Yeah, hi. So I retired from the Forest Service after 32 years in July of 2021. And then a few months after that, I started working with NRCS through our program for retirees. Doesn't have to be a federal retiree, but I happen to be one. So I'm providing agroforestry support to the National Forester. And one of the things I'm going to be working on is pulling together, I'm not calling them case studies because they're not going to be intense, really detailed, but examples or profiles of urban or small farms agroforestry. So I would have found this presentation interesting anyway, but it's been helpful from that perspective. So really appreciate it, Jim, and
Great
to be here.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Susan.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll get on to the next part. And again, you are all welcome to stay.